The night caller, Edgar Cook, Australian serial killer. Unusual serial killer whose methods seemed as random as his choice of victims. His behavior was inconsistent and bizarre. He terrorized the city of Perth, Western Australia by committing 22 violent crimes, 8 of which resulted in deaths. Edgar Cook was born on the 25th of February 1931 in Victoria Park, a suburb of Perth, and was the eldest of 3 children. As a child, Cook's father showed no passion towards his oldest child and only son, and would often become a victim of his father's alcoholic addiction, resulting in beatings for no apparent reason. Cook was beaten by his father when he tried to protect his mother from his father's violent outbursts of rage. Cook had been bullied at school for the impediments of a hare lip and a cleft palate, although whether this contributed to his later crimes is unknown. The operations left him with a slight facial deformity and he spoke in a mumble. Cook would later serve 18 months in jail for burning down a church after he was rejected in a choir audition. At age 21, Cook joined the permanent military forces but was discharged 3 months later after it was discovered that before enlistment he had a series of convictions for theft, breaking and entering, and arson. A year later, on the 14th of October 1953, Cook, aged 22, married Sarah, Sally, Larvin, a 19-year-old waitress, at the Methodist Church in Cannington. They were to have 7 children. Cook's strange killing spree involved a series of seemingly unrelated hit and runs, stabbings, stranglings and shootings which had Perth completely terrorized. This was an unusual serial killer whose methods seemed as random as his choice of victims. His behavior was inconsistent and bizarre. The various shootings had been carried out with several different rifles. Victims had been stabbed with knives and scissors, and hit with an axe. One victim was shot dead after answering a knock on the door. Several were killed after waking while Cook was robbing their homes. 2 were shot while sleeping without their homes being disturbed. After stabbing one victim, he got lemonade from the refrigerator and sat on the veranda drinking it. Another victim was strangled with the cord from her bedside lamp, her dead body raped, then dragged to a neighbor's lawn, where she was violated with an empty whiskey bottle which was left cradled in her arms. In the 1960s, people often left the keys in their car's ignition overnight, and Cook would steal a car almost every night, returning it before the owner awoke. It was later discovered that the cars involved in several hit and runs had been returned without the owners realizing they had been stolen. Cook was to later claim he just wanted to hurt people. During the police investigation, more than 30,000 males over the age of 12 were fingerprinted and more than 60,000 .22 rifles were located and test-fired. Cook was finally caught after a rifle was found hidden in a bush in August 1963. Ballistic tests proved the gun had been used to murder Shirley MacLeod. Police returned to the location and tied a similar inoperable rifle to the bush with fishing line, constructing a hide in which police waited for the owner to collect it, which Cook did 17 days later. When captured, Cook confessed to numerous crimes, including 22 violent crimes, 8 murders, and 14 attempted murders. He was convicted on the specimen charge of murdering John Lindsay Sturkey, one of Cook's 5 Australia Day, 1963, shooting victims. In his confessions, Cook demonstrated an exceptionally good memory for the details of his crimes irrespective of how long ago he had committed the offenses. For example, he confessed to more than 250 burglaries and was able to detail exactly what he took, including the number and denominations of the coins he had stolen from each location. The other murder confessions included those of Gillian Brewer and Rosemary Anderson, for which Daryl Beamish and John Button had already been convicted and imprisoned. Cook's confessions were referred to in appeals by Beamish and Button, but, in Button's case, which was heard first, although Cook had given details withheld by police that only the killer would have known, little credence was given to Cook's testimony, as the vehicle Cook claimed he had used had an external steel sun visor. The appeal judges did not believe a body could be thrown over the roof, as Cook claimed, without ripping the visor off. Beamish's appeal was dismissed after the judges cross-referenced Cook's evidence with that of the Button appeal. West Australia Chief Justice Sir Albert Wolfe called him a villainous, unscrupulous liar, and the prosecution claimed that both confessions were an attempt to prolong his own trial. Pleading not guilty on the grounds of insanity, at trial Cook's defense lawyers claimed that Cook suffered from schizophrenia, but this claim was dismissed after the director of the state mental health services testified that he was sane. The state would not allow independent psychiatric specialists to examine Cook. Cook was convicted of willful murder on 28 November 1963 after a 3-day trial by jury in the Supreme Court of Western Australia before Justice Virtue. He was sentenced to death and, despite having grounds to appeal, ordered his lawyers not to reply, claiming that he had killed and deserved to pay for what he had done. 10 minutes before the sentence was carried out, Cook swore on the Bible, renewing his rejected claim that he had been the killer of Gillian Brewer and Rosemary Anderson. Cook was the last person to be hanged in the state of Western Australia, on 26 October 1964. Cook is buried in Fremantle Cemetery, above the remains of the child killer, Martha Rendell, who was hanged in Fremantle Prison in 1909 and was the last woman to be hanged in Western Australia. The wrong men. 2 other Australians were convicted of crimes later attributed to Cook. Daryl Beamish, a deaf-mute, convicted in 1961 for the 1959 murder of Gillian Macpherson Brewer, a wealthy woman originally from Melbourne. He served 15 years despite Cook's 1963 confession to the crime. His conviction was quashed in 2005 after evidence pointed to Cook being the killer. John Button, who was jailed for 5 years for manslaughter in the death of his girlfriend, Rosemary Anderson, a conviction that was quashed in 2002 after evidence proved Cook was the killer. A memoir, The Sharknet by Robert Drew, later made into a movie, provides one author's impressions the effect the murders had on the Perth of that era. According to the book, more people bought dogs for security and locked back doors and garages that had never been secured before. The Nedlands monster also features in Tim Winton's 1991 novel Cloud Street. The Walkley Award-winning journalist, Estelle Blackburn, spent 6 years writing the biographical story Broken Lives, about Cook's life and criminal career, focusing particularly on the devastation left on his victims and their families. What Estelle Blackburn said about Eric Cook in his book. He said, Cook, Edgar Eric, 1931–1964, murderer, was born on 25 February 1931 at Victoria Park, Perth, eldest of 3 children of Vivian Thomas Cook, a native-born shop assistant, and his wife Christian, née Edgar, from Scotland. Educated at 5 different schools, including Perth Junior Technical and Forest High, from the age of 14 Eric took a succession of semi-skilled jobs. Having served in the Citizen Military Forces, he joined the Permanent Military Forces on 27 May 1952, but was discharged on 28 August when it was discovered that, before enlistment, he had a series of convictions for theft, breaking and entering, and arson. On 14 October 1953 at the Methodist Church, Cannington, He married Sarah, Sally, Larvin, a 19-year-old waitress. They were to have 7 children. In the early hours of the 27th of January 1963, a series of random shootings with a .22-inch, (0.55 centimeters) rifle occurred in the suburbs of Perth. The victims were a couple who were wounded in a parked car at Cottesloe, a male accountant, fatally wounded by a single shot to the head while asleep in a flat nearby, an 18-year-old student, John Sturkey, killed by a single bullet to the head while sleeping on the veranda of a boarding house at Nedlands, and a retired grocer who was similarly murdered when answering the bell of his front door in the next street. Public anxiety was exacerbated by 2 murders a fortnight later, for which Brian William Robinson was charged with both, tried for one and hanged. January's pattern and fears returned in August when an 18-year-old female student was killed by a single shot to the head while babysitting at Dalkeith. It was for this murder that Cook was captured by police on the 1st of September when he attempted to retrieve the hidden weapon. In addition to the 4 who died by Cook's marksmanship, he was acknowledged by the state to be responsible for the murders of a South Perth beautician, stabbed on the 30th of January 1959, and of a female social worker, strangled in West Perth on the 16th of February 1963. Brought to trial on the 25th of November 1963 for the murder of Sturkey, through his counsel Cook sought a verdict of not guilty on the grounds of insanity. Evidence revealed that this short, dark-haired man with a quick temper and a retentive memory had been brutalized by a father for whom he had never formed affection. He had further been tormented at school for the impediments of a cleft palate and hair lip, hospitalized frequently for head injuries, suspected brain damage and recurrent headaches, and admitted to an asylum. Life's blows extended to the next generation. The eldest of his children was mentally retarded, while another was born with a deformed arm. Dr. A.S. Ellis, Director of Mental Health Services, rejected the defense's claim that Cook suffered from schizophrenia. The state permitted no other psychiatric specialist to examine him. The death sentence was pronounced on the 27th of November. With 6 convictions for minor crimes at the time of his arrest for murder, Cook later claimed to have committed more than 200 thefts, 5 hit-and-run offences against young women, and the 2 murders for each of which Darrell Raymond Beamish and John Button were already imprisoned. These confessions led to unsuccessful appeals. Little credence was placed in Cook's testimony by the court. The Chief Justice Sir Albert Wolfe called him a villainous, unscrupulous liar. There were inconsistencies in Cook's testimony, but in confessions to his chaplain and in sworn statements he reaffirmed his guilt in each case. The circumstances in which confessions were originally obtained from Beamish and Button, together with arguable flaws in judicial procedure and judicial reasoning in their appeals, leave open the possibility that each suffered a miscarriage of justice which Cook sought to overturn. Although opponents of capital punishment had organized protest in several previous cases, there was little public dissent from the sentence imposed on Cook. Only one woman kept vigil outside Fremantle Prison on the morning of his execution, the 26th of October 1964. He was buried in an unmarked grave at Fremantle Cemetery. His wife, 3 daughters and 3 of his 4 sons survived him. Cook was the last person to be hanged in Western Australia for willful murder before the state abolished capital punishment in 1984. In the period when his crimes had remained unsolved, there was a discernible change in Perth's attitude towards personal and household security. Police and politicians were widely criticised. Gunsmiths, locksmiths and the Dogs' Refuge did a brisk trade, and the breezy habits of an informal town in a hot climate were no longer innocently enjoyed. The social impact of Cook's crimes and the atmosphere in which he was tried are imaginatively but faithfully reflected in Tim Winton's novel, Cloud Street, Melbourne, 1991. A chance meeting at a dance led journalist Estelle Blackburn into the case of serial killer Eric Edgar Cook, who terrorized Perth in the 1960s, as well as two men who had been falsely convicted of Cook's crimes. Estelle has been interviewed by the Sunday Herald Sun newspaper. The case at the center of the doco after the night. You came to it by chance, didn't you? Yes, at the time I was a press secretary for the Premier of Western Australia. I'd been a political journalist, and I was invited to join the government, so I went to the dark side of journalism. I was working for the Premier when I went to a dance and an odd guy. He was a bit doubtful, but he was a great dancer, so I danced with this guy every Thursday for quite a while. And a friend of mine came over from England and he was wrongly charged with something. He rang me from the police lockup and said, "Help, Estelle." So I rang this dancing guy, Jim, and said I can't come dancing tonight, a friend of mine's been framed by the cops, I've got to help him. And Jim said, "Don't talk to me about the police framing people. They framed my brother for a murder, Cook did." Did you remember the crimes of Eric Edgar Cook? I lived through Cook's terror. I was 13 at the time. It struck terror in my heart hearing the name again. I got my friend sorted out, and of course, as a nosy journo, what's all this about Cook and your brother? And that's how it happened. A chance meeting at a dance, and a chance wrongful charge of a friend. And before that, you weren't a crime journalist at all. No, there I was working for the Premier, and suddenly this chance meeting happened and I realized I couldn't reinvestigate a 30-odd-year-old murder and work for a Premier. So I gave it up, got myself a 2-day-a-week little salaried job and started to look at the murders of 30 years previously. It took a lot of work, a lot of sleuthing, so clearly I couldn't work full-time. I sold an investment house to fund myself. It cost me my financial security, but it's enriched me in every other way. What have those rewards been? It's been wonderful to have achieved this, not only for falsely convicted Button and Beamish, but for justice to have a look at itself, for people to realize that injustice does happen. There's a stupid joke that everyone in prison says they're innocent. Well, latest figures are there's about 4% who are innocent. I think people are more aware of it now. These, Button and Beamish, were the longest standing convictions in Australia to be overturned at the time. It shows you should never give up hope. Yes, yes, yes. I've been to lots of innocence conferences, overseas, and I was so touched. One exoneree at a conference in Toronto said, "The moment somebody put his hand on my shoulder in prison and said, 'I believe you,' I started to live again. I was so touched by that. These guys had given up hope. They were out of prison when I met them, they'd been paroled. They both came extremely close to being executed. They were out of prison physically, but not emotionally. They were living their lives with a big sign saying, 'Murderer,' over their heads. What's the message that you want people to take from after the night? I suppose the main message is that it is still happening. These were two particularly dreadful wrongful convictions. Coming across it by chance, 30 years ago, has got me now involved in wrongful conviction in other cases, and I think as much as we need to respect the justice system and our police force, they do a very hard job, long hours, underpaid, dangerous. When there's corruption in our justice system and it goes wrong, there are long-term effects. And much as there have been changes since the 60s, it is still happening. How does it go wrong so often? It's generally police who get it wrong. Sometimes over-enthusiastic prosecutors, but generally most wrongful convictions are through police misconduct. I don't want to be anti-police at all, but wrongful conviction is still happening too often. You're at pains to say that you're not anti-police, so your work has not totally destroyed your faith in law and order. No, not totally. It hasn't destroyed my faith, and in fact the lawyer who worked for Beamish, one of the cases in the doco, who later became Chief Justice of Western Australia and Governor of Western Australia, he said that the Beamish case totally destroyed his faith in the justice system. But my faith is improved by the fact that the justice system is now aware that there are now people working on cases. They can't get away with it. There have been royal commissions. Things have improved, but I am still working on cases. But it's wonderful when it is remedied. The wonderful thing about this case, about Button and Beamish, is that it healed a lot of other people as well. Extraordinary audio files have revealed how WA's worst ever serial killer was gripped with power and just wanted to hurt people when he opened fire on unsuspecting West Australians. The previously unheard audio files, obtained by the West Australian, give extraordinary insight into the thoughts of a serial killer. Much of the audio centres around Cook's crimes on the night of Australia Day, 1963, when he stole cash, rifle and a car and opened fire on innocent victims. He told how a feeling of power led to him shooting Rowena Reeves and Nicholas August in a car outside the Cottesloe Civic Centre. It wasn't an impulse, it was stronger than an impulse, he said. I bought this rifle up and put a bullet in it. And at that time I never aimed at the people in the car. It was then that this power came over me. This feeling of power rather as though it was light. It was like a mantle, or like a cloud over me. Ms. Reeves and Mr. August survived, but Brian Weir, John Sturkey and George Walmsley were all shot dead after being fired at close range. I just wanted to hurt people, Cook said in his trial. I was still gripped in this power, which made me shoot in the first place, and I felt as though if there was an army of men in front of me they could not stop me, and I could have walked through a brick wall, if there had been one there. That's how I felt. The recordings were found gathering dust in a dark recess of WA's historic Supreme Court building several years ago. The degraded tapes, which include Cook's candid descriptions of some of his crimes, have been expertly restored and will be played in full in public for the first time. On 2014 Eric's family has been interviewed. His daughter Jennifer said about her dad Eric, "The nation knew him as the Nedlands monster, the night caller, the notorious serial killer who murdered 8 people, but I knew him by a different name. I called him Dad." And on the same day every year, she walks down death row, flowers in hand, to a cell where the condemned once waited for the noose and a long drop. Within the walls of the old Fremantle prison, she lays the stems and petals down in memory of the last man to hang in WA. His widow Sarah, Sally, Cook, now 78, sat in her home this week with 2 of their 5 surviving children, Jennifer, 55, and Tony, 57. The sins of the father, the betrayal and crimes of a husband, are things each has dealt with in very different ways. Tomorrow it will be 50 years since Cook went on a rampage in the western suburbs, shooting 5 people and plunging Perth into a state of fear. It was neither the first nor the last time that he killed, but, on the eve of that anniversary, his family spoke to the West Australian. 5 decades on, they still feel compelled to offer condolences to victims not of their making. Their own personal struggles on the long journey towards a place of healing, their determination to be defined as something more than the wife and children of a serial killer, are something they neither expect nor ask sympathy for. Jennifer Cook, who has never spoken publicly and now goes by a different name, dabbed at her eyes as she visited a confusing place within herself, where a 6-year-old girl's memories of a doting father struggle to reconcile with the terrible truth of his life and crimes. She remembers a man who played with her and bought her a big doll, who a week before he was executed wrote her a message on a torn piece of napkin smuggled out of his cell. It read, "To my princess, with love forever in my heart, Daddy." She still has the napkin and an abundance of hurt and anger. The same man who penned those words caused so much pain. "I feel very sad that my father did what he did," she said. "It's inexcusable. I feel for the families and the victims. I missed out on a father. That is the ultimate price I had to pay, and I'm angry at my father for doing that to me." Jennifer's annual pilgrimage to her father's cell on October 26, the anniversary of his execution nearly 49 years ago, is something she has done alone and without the knowledge of her mother and brother. Tony, dry-eyed, said he believed the fact that his sister was only 6 when Cook hanged had a lot to do with the discrepancies between their recollections of the man they called Dad. "That age gap was enormous," Jennifer said. "At the time, I remember Dad as being really loving. I think I had a bond with my father because there were already 2 boys, and then I came along, and I was his little princess, his little girl. I was the apple of his eye really. He treated me very well. I have fond memories." Tony said his earliest memories were of being cruelly lashed with words or beaten by angry hands, or watching his disabled older brother Michael, getting it for nothing. "My memories of him were not that he was always bad, but there was always this edge, that he could fly into a rage," he said. Only Sally knew both the charming Jekyll and the violent Hyde that was Eric Edgar Cook. It was 1953 when she met the man who would father her 7 children, a charismatic truck driver with a hair lip and a hard-luck background who worked at the metropolitan markets in West Perth, where she had a job as a waitress. "I was 18 when I met him, 19 when I married him," Sally said. "He was quite nice. He was 21 and the most handsome-looking bloke." Estelle Blackburn, a member of the CLA and the author of a Broken Lives book, in research for her book, had access to a serial killer's medical, legal, police and prison files and interviewed 2 psychiatrists and a psychologist who had dealt with him. She said, "What makes a serial killer? Eric Edgar Cook was a perfect fit for the serial killer type identified by criminal profilers. He was physically and emotionally abused as a child in a dysfunctional family. He escaped through disassociation and fantasy, sought to boost his low esteem through self-aggrandizement, raged against the society that ostracized him, and he sought revenge, power and control through violent acts starting with arson and escalating to power over life and death." Cook was born in February 1931 to a violent, alcoholic teenage father who loathed at first sight the son born with the facial deformity of a cleft palate and cleft lip. Eric had a misshapen mouth and bad mumble, surgery and speech therapy not in those days able to remedy what was called a hair lip, as it can today. He was subjected to daily beatings from his father using his fists, belts and sticks, as well as such general neglect and emotional cruelty as to leave him in no doubt that his father didn't want him. His mother also suffered at her husband's brutality, living in fear and poverty, working to raise him and 2 younger daughters on her meager kitchen hand and cleaning wages, her husband drinking all he earned as a motor spare parts salesman. The hungry young Eric, who grew up describing himself as the freak of the family, took to wandering the streets to escape his father's cruelty and to steal food. School was more of the same. The children taunted him, mimicking his speech. He was expelled from Subiaco Primary School in his first year for stealing, and his behavior brought canings at subsequent schools. He joined the Scarborough Junior Surf Lifesaving Club at 14, and his desperation for inclusion and admiration led him to steal a watch and engraved it to look like an award. On discovery of this theft, and suspicion on other thefts from lockers, Cook was rejected by the club on the excuse of him having had several blackouts. He suffered blackouts regularly and spent a lot of time in hospital due to them, as well as because of headaches, sinus trouble and many illnesses and injuries from being accident-prone, some accidents caused by daredevil acts for notoriety. Though accident-prone while attention-seeking, he grew into a cunning and adroit criminal, becoming a particularly deft cat burglar who could get through the narrowest or highest windows, break one piece of stained glass door or remove one oov to reach the key inside, and, after propping open a back door for quick getaway, stealthily steal in the presence of the owners leaving school at 14. He learnt his way around the streets through his first job as a delivery boy for Central Provision Stores in North Perth. He stole to supplement the few shillings pocket money left after he gave his wages to his struggling mother. As he grew up, stealing funded his efforts to make friends and to impress women. Arson can be an accurate indicator. An indicator on his road to serious crime was the common precursor of arson, seen by profilers as an attempt to gain power and a feeling of success. At aged 17, Cook started setting fire to the houses and flats he broke into, after stealing food and money and slashing clothing and bedding. Always cunning, he smashed a window in a house to make it look like a break-in when the friendly owner had given him a key to look after it while on holiday. When caught for the break-ins and arson, police examining his background was sympathetic, describing him as one of life's unfortunates, so at age 18, too late, he finally received the intervention he had needed years earlier. In an attempt to rescue him from a life of crime and early symptoms of schizophrenia, he was paroled after 3 months of his 3-year jail sentence. Some time in prison so he wouldn't think he'd got away with it, but not so long as to be contaminated by hardened criminals. He was watched closely during parole, and received an excellent report, even though the psychiatrist he was ordered to see at a mental hospital merely labeled him a liar beyond help. A Methodist minister he met there, the Rev. George Jenkins, offered to rehabilitate him, taking him into the fold of his South Perth Methodist Church. Cook gained an active social life, particularly hockey, through acceptance by the young Methodists, and he enthusiastically embraced Bible classes. But he was indeed beyond help. He later stole from his Methodist friends, and the Rev. Jenkins finally accompanied him to his execution for the worst crime of murder. The Methodist Church inadvertently introduced him to the wealth of the western suburbs when he started attending the Nedlands Methodist Church and was welcomed into the homes of parishioners. The Methodists' care and effort at rehabilitation could not counter the rejection of his dismissal from the CMF, now the Reserve Army. Exclusion from an organization or activity where they shine is a pointer to serial killers' future violent behavior. Fast, accurate shooter, but dismissed from the Army. Lance Corporal Cook's flair for fast and accurate shooting trained him in weaponry and helped satisfy his need to dominate. His dismissal from the Army, which excludes anyone with a criminal conviction, was dire punishment for the break-ins and arsons. He had really enjoyed the Army's fellowship and the regimentation. Ironically, it could have been that enjoyment, and the sense of rejection when told that his speech impediment would prevent him rising in rank, that was the trauma trigger which led to him starting the arson soon after he desperately tried to get back into the CMF, going to Melbourne at the age of 21 and joining there. In the 3.5 months before his WA conviction was discovered, he excelled further at weapons training, being able to shoot a native grass spear from the hip at up to 13 meters, and to spend a magazine of 10 bullets in 8 seconds without losing accuracy. He returned to Perth, and in a further attempt to gain admiration, he lied about having been in the Korean War and having a metal plate in his head from his injuries. Cook met Sally at work at the Metropolitan Markets, married her in 1953 and had a son 6 months later and another son, Tony, a year after that. But the love and happy home was also too late to overcome his early damage. The charming man who Sally's mother thought was a good catch turned violent after the first child, and Sally was trapped by a cruel, violent, womanizing husband. Dressing well, in keeping with the criminal's pattern of concerned tour appearance to counter low self-esteem, he played bowls in the city, finding girlfriends there, and amongst usherettes at the city cinemas he also frequented. Sally was too loyal to leave him, even when advised to do so after he was jailed for 2 years for crashing a stolen car when following a girlfriend to Bunbury just 2 months after Tony's birth. The birth of twins followed his return from jail, but they couldn't stop his cravings for attention, friends, peeping Tom thrills, and for winning the game against society by so audaciously invading people's homes and stealing from under their noses. His takings supplemented his wages gained from various laboring and truck driving jobs. He prowled most weekends, cunningly reading the West Australians' wedding notices and breaking into the brides' homes in the knowledge no one would be there, and he studied the floor plans of big houses from the West's weekly home architecture features to know his way around them. He always wore a hat, pulled low over his face to disguise his disfigurement, and wore women's leather gloves he kept hidden above the toilet at home to ensure he was never caught out again by fingerprints as he had been over the arsons. He often left some coins in purses so that might not be noticed. Another trait seen as indicating future violence is sexual perversion, including the voyeurism that had Cook regularly watching lovers through house and car windows and stealing panties from clotheslines despite having work and family. The pain of rejection rankled. His first violence in September 1958 may have been sparked by failing to win a young woman he once followed home from a bus stop and used to watch in her bedroom from behind a street tree. He stole her father's car and ran down a mother cycling nearby, saying, in his confession, "One just wanted to hurt someone, and she was it for the night." He continued wanting to hurt people, explaining it with a story that his first son had run across the road and been hit by a taxi. He soon fractured the skull of a teenager asleep in her bed in Applecross, then deliberately ran down another woman in a stolen car in Belmont. He claimed that his first murder in January 1959 was from panic, stabbing Penina Berkman in South Perth after she awoke and fought back. At the end of the same year, he was ferocious in his hatchet and scissor attack on a sleeping Gillian Brewer whose sexual activity with several men he had watched during the previous months. Rejection was most likely the motive for his Australia Day rampage, having been told to piss off by the man he was watching parked in a car with a woman late at night. This time he had a rifle. This night he had total power over everyone. The power of God that he claimed overtook him during his murders let him disassociate himself from the revenge he had wanted all his life. His rage escalated when he strangled his next sleeping victim, dominating her further through necrophilia and abuse with a bottle. When he was caught after his shooting murder in August 1963, he gave up and told all, no doubt wanting Perth people to know how he had won over them, and remembering the benefits or confession from his childhood Catholicism. He admitted to 8 murders, including 2 that other youths had been convicted of and jailed for, wanting them freed before he hanged, and to 14 attacks on people who survived, 5 of them deliberate hit runs and 5 of them attacks on sleeping women. He had an extraordinary memory, detailing features of homes and exact denominations of coins he stole. His break-ins and thefts, car thefts and the reports by frightened women of a man who dazzled them with a torch when they awoke to find him in their bedrooms were too numerous for the police to record. Deemed sane by the Director of Mental Health Services and the defense being refused its request for a second opinion, his fate was inevitable in Perth's hanging days. It was almost as inevitable given his formative experience and development fitting so well the pattern of serial killers. On death row, he read his Bible a lot, spoke often about his wife and children, expressed much concern about John Button and Darry Beamish, who were expressing their anger for his murders, and went on a hunger strike over not being believed about them, and banged his head against the wall for a long time after his father visited. He joked when being weighed and measured for the executioner, and walked to the gallows calmly, saying he would pay his debt to society. There are many in Perth still deeply affected by Cook's activities, including those he condemned to the heartache of having loved ones so cruelly stolen from him, and others so traumatized that they can't sleep without the lient on. For them and most of Perth, he was indeed the Nedlands monster, as he was dubbed. It would be understandably too difficult for them to accept the view of South African profiler Mickey Pistorius, who stated in 2000, "Serial killers are not monsters. They are human beings with tortured souls."